Very bright today. Okay, well, welcome folks. First of all, I want to acknowledge those who were here long before us and also their living descendants, and to remind us that we're here today on the traditional lands and spiritual home of the Indigenous people of the Adelaide Plains, known as the Kaurna people. So today's story from the stacks is looking at serial thrillers, that is, serialised crime and mystery stories from colonial times through to the early 20th century. These appeared in newspapers and or magazines in Australia and abroad, mainly in Britain, and some of these writers had a South Australian connection, at least for a time. Writers of crime fiction really made crime pay, although the amounts varied vastly. Some earned only a stipend, and some made a comfortable living, and several made enough to build a mansion, or several. Only a handful of the magazines that published fiction in Australia and overseas will be mentioned today, but there were many, many more, some of which ran for decades. These magazines launched some of the best-known writers of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, not just in crime and mystery writing, but in romance, children's literature and classic social commentary. I'll be showing you where to find serial thrillers and short fiction published in Australian newspapers as we go through. This lithograph of a work by S.T. Gill was published by Penman and Galbraith. It shows Rundle Street looking east in 1845. You can see a busy street scene on the corner of Rundle and King William Streets, including the famous Beehive Corner. But look at the gentleman on the right, totally engrossed in his newspaper. Early newspaper journalists recorded crime and punishment in graphic detail. Their information came from court reports and eyewitness accounts, including their own. In early South Australia, colonial reporting, individual stories didn't carry bylines, so individual reporters mostly used aliases like Rufus and Vox. So many journalists remained unnamed even into the 1920s, as did fiction writers, but not all of them. So it's impossible to talk about serialised Australian crime and mystery fiction, or indeed any Australian colonial fiction, without mentioning this magazine. First published in September 1865, the Australian Journal ran for 97 years until 1962. It promised to be a weekly record of amusing and instructive literature, science and the arts. It was originally aimed at women, but soon became a publisher of short stories written by Australians for all age groups, and it gathered a readership of men and youth as well as women. So the first issue of the Australian Journal appeared in September 1865. It featured part one of a story by a woman named Eileen Davitt. The work was a serialised novel called Force and Fraud. Eileen Davitt was a teacher and an artist, as well as a writer, and Force and Fraud may well have been Australia's first murder mystery by a female author. This is a copy of the novel in its entirety. It didn't actually appear in book form until 1993, thanks to the determined efforts by literary archaeologist and writer Dr Lucy Sussex. There's also a later e-book edition by clandestine publishers. Some of you may be familiar, those of you who are interested in crime in Australia, with the name Davitt, and that's because Melbourne-based female crime writing group Scarlet Stiletto named their annual Women's Crime Writing Awards after Eileen Davitt. I can see a few heads nodding, the Davitt Award. So the majority of Australian colonial crime writers were male. but there were published female crime and mystery writers, as well as Eileen Davitt. There was Mary Helena Fortune, who wrote under the pen names of Waif Wanderer and W.W. Mary Fortune wrote around, well, we don't know, somewhere between 400, maybe even closer to 500 stories over a period of about 30 years. But these were not all in the crime genre. So here's a review of the Australian Journal found in Trove. Now, you can't read it. I'll just go back. I'll just read you a section of it. It's from the 1910 Tamworth Observer and Northern Advertiser, and it says, in part, "The November issue of the Australian Journal to hand is brimful of interest. Another stage of the 3 serials is reached, and with never waning interest, each grows more intense. W.W. turns over yet another leaf of his well-known album with nothing short of the usual success." Now, as we've just heard, W.W., or Waif Wanderer, was not a he, but a she. The album to which the reviewer is referring is the Detectives album. It was also a police procedural and fairly accurate because Mary Fortune had lived on the goldfields with a police trooper. In fact, a lot of her stories are set on the goldfields. The police trooper was her second husband, and a police trooper, as I said, he was also a bigamous husband who deserted his wife. And yes, I did say he was a police trooper. In fairness to the reviewer, nobody knew that W.W. or Waif Wanderer was Mary Fortune right up until the 1950s. The Detectives album took the form of separate stories by W.W. in the Australian Journal, which we've just seen, from 1868 to 1908. Mary moved to Melbourne around 1868, I think minus the bigamist husband. 7 stories of hers were published as the Detectives album in Melbourne in 1871, and it thus became the first book of detective fiction to be published in Australia. That's detective as distinct from mystery or crime fiction. So W.W. also wrote hundreds more stories, as I said, not always crime-based. And she also wrote a not strictly accurate memoir 26 years ago, also titled The Diggings from 55, that's 1855. This was republished as The Fortunes of Mary Fortune in Melbourne in 1989. She was definitely among the world's earliest women writers of detective fiction, and certainly the first to specialise in the field in Australia, but she never received the acclaim given to other women, to other authors, including women authors, in the UK and in the USA. So I'll just go back a bit. That's the cover of the Australian Journal for the week ending September 1st, 1866, and it's not a very good copy. I was unable to source a better version, so again, it's almost impossible to read, but I've actually included it for the illustration, which is interesting because of the detail of the costume and the room interior. You see a well-dressed couple in prosperous, elaborately furnished surroundings, possibly a dining room or a parlour, and the price, for those of you who are interested in prices, the price for the magazine was 3pence, or for those who grew up post-decimal currency, that was 3 pennies. And the title of the book, the instalment, is The Secrets of Balbrook, a tale by Waif Wanderer, and this issue features Chapter 1 or Instalment 1. So W.W.'s short stories were published in newspapers as well as magazines and read across the country, and that included South Australia. At least one was serialised in the Kapunda Herald and other regional newspapers. This one, Dan Lyon's Doom, appeared in a supplement to the Port Adelaide News in 1884. Despite distance, novels were definitely available in Australia to those who could afford them, but for many readers, magazines and newspapers were cheaper and easier to come by. They were lighter than a book, they held other useful material, and certainly in the case of newspapers, had lots of other uses. For example, squares of newspaper on a string or wire used to hang in the dunny before toilet paper rolls became a household staple. Newspapers and magazines, most magazines, not all, were mass-produced on cheap paper, and most of them weren't designed to last, certainly in terms of the newspapers. So it makes original copies hard to find, except in reference libraries or special collections. And that's why the National Library has digitised many online Australian magazines, which you can access through the National Library catalogue, and you can actually read them online, complete with ads and illustrations. Fabulous, and in colour, if there was colour. Australian newspapers can be searched through Trove, but given the mass of content, finding fiction published in newspapers can be tricky. But there's now a way to find crime fiction, or any other type of fiction for that matter, published in Australian newspapers up until the mid-20th century. And this is through a fairly recent initiative called To Be Continued, the Australian Newspaper Database. I'll just go back on that. So the initiative is called To Be Continued, the Australian Newspaper Fiction Database. Now, this session is being recorded, so there's no need to take notes unless you really want to. So let's have a look. I'm going to start with some background. This is the intro to an article about the project. It's not the site itself. And in this article, Catherine Bode, who is one of the beginners of the project, gives the background to this initiative, which began in 2013. And the article tells how she and a bibliographer called Carol Hetherington worked together to discover serialised fiction in Trove's digitised newspapers. Are you all familiar with Trove, by the way? Yeah, okay. Anyone who's not, see one of the librarians or come and see me afterwards. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource of Australia's digitised newspapers, so you can read them online instead of having to hunt out old print versions. Okay, so the Australian newspaper database shows a fiction database, shows all stories so far located and across many genres. In 2018, when this project To Be Continued was launched, there were 21,000 fictional stories that had been located, most of which people didn't know about. That figure is now well above 56,000 and growing, thanks to the work of volunteers who are dubbed, when they work for Trove, they're called voluntroves. Much of the content of the fiction database, of the newspaper database rather, was originally sourced from overseas, and not just from Great Britain and America. There were writers who were published in Australian newspapers from colonial times onwards, from places like France, Germany, Hungary, and they were, of course, and across many genres, a lot of political stuff, a lot of spy thriller stuff, and they were in translation, of course. So within this article, you'll find links to the actual newspaper fiction database, but they're a little hard to find. The Explore button on the top left actually doesn't go to the fiction database. It's something I think they have overlooked. It goes back to the Trove newspaper, the general newspaper database. So I'm going to just take a few minutes to show you how to find the Australian fiction newspaper database and how to navigate its search page. Okay, so this is the welcome page, and this is where you need to go if you want to look at Australian fiction that was published from colonial era right through to the 1950s in Australian newspapers. It's easy enough to find through your web search engine, but there's one little trick. You have to add a word or a phrase onto To Be Continued. Otherwise, you'll get a list that includes YouTube sound effects, a movie plot, video memes, and the relevant site that you want is right down the bottom, and it's a long way down. So the easier way to do it, I'll take you through the steps. There are 3 steps. Step 1. Sound like I'm advertising something, oh dear. Step 1, find To Be Continued site online. So type into your usual web search engine, that can be what most people use, Google or Microsoft, whatever it is. Type in To Be Continued, and add one or more of these words: Australia or Australian, newspaper, fiction, or even database. Or just type into your search engine, Australian newspaper fiction, and that will get you to this page. Now, I've got an arrow at the top, and the arrow is what will lead you into the rest of the database. That little green, you won't see the green arrow, but where that green arrow is, you click Explore on that page, and it should then open to this. Okay, yeah, that's right, because that's the gate, the arrow, the Explore. I'll just go back. That Explore is the gateway to here, to the search engine. So from here, you can open 3 headings at the top of the page. You can open Explore if you want to look for stories and authors. You can contribute if you want to be a voluntrove. You can transcribe the stories, or you can go to About for more background and details. So use your mouse to go to the Explore button, as I've shown you. And then, once you're on this search page, you get 6 ways to search the Australian fiction newspaper database. So you can either search within the title, by the newspaper title, by the author name, the nationality of the author, the gender of the author, or the length of the story. That's really useful for researchers. You don't always know the full title. Obviously, if you know the full title of the book or the story that you're looking for, you put that straight in to the title up on the top left. But if you don't, and you're just generally looking for stories, you use a term that you might find in a crime or mystery story. So what I did was look at a number of things. I looked at jewels, ghost, gold, dozens of stories on gold in the title. This is in the title we're talking about. Bushranger, loads and loads of those. And of course, library, because I'm a librarian, book, diary and letter. I was very disappointed to find that library only turned up once in the title of a piece of crime fiction. Remember, we're talking about crime fiction at the moment. But I need to point out that the literary database, the fiction database, will bring you up any piece of fiction written with by the person you're looking for, or with that word in the title. So I might put in maiden and get 50 or 100 stories that are romances, and maybe 10 of those might be about a maiden who's been kidnapped by some villainous evildoer. But they usually, in fact, they always get rescued. Or they throw themselves in a river and die, but, you know, shame and all that. It was a different time, different place. Okay, so I put in letter, for example here, into the title box. And that's what I got. That's a fraction of what I got. And then it was up to me. Now, what you'll see is that, like for dead letter up the top, that doesn't mean that there were 8 different stories. It means, or 7 or whatever that number is, it means that it appeared in 7 or 8 different publications across Australia. So it's really, really useful if you just want to browse. It's fun, and eventually you can get to the real story. I haven't got time to go through that now, but our librarians will be trained in this, and you can ask any one of them, or come and talk to me if you're really eager to get started after the session. Okay, all right. So this is another search, and this time it was a search by author. So I put in Waif Wanderer. I also put in Mary Fortune, and I put in WW into the author box. You have to be a bit careful with the author box, because sometimes the stories appeared under the surname and the initials, not the surname and the first name of the person. So Ernest Hornung, who we'll look at briefly a bit later, could be E.W. Hornung, could be Ernest Hornung, except he wasn't usually, but sometimes, or it could be just Hornung. So usually use the family name first if you know the name, or the pseudonym, just put it in. I searched under WW as well, and also got a lot of hits. Okay, As you can see, Dan Lyon's Doom, which we saw briefly earlier, very, very popular. Now, where I have that arrow on the left, it shows that it was published in South Australia, in the Port Adelaide News, and there's a bit more to searching the Australian newspaper database, fiction database, but this will get you started. And what you do next is you click on that arrow on the down arrow, where that second green arrow is, and that will show you more detail, and eventually will get you to the instalment page. Just experiment, keep clicking. And as I said, very, very popular. Okay. If you want to read some of Waif Wanderer's stories, short stories, without having to read by instalment and for free, you can get them in Project Gutenberg, Australia. Any of you familiar with Project Gutenberg? A few heads nodding. Okay. Project Gutenberg is a project that makes writing of all number of authors, including some fairly recent ones, available to people for free. There's a very large database just called Project Gutenberg, which is, I believe, is the American version, but geographically there are other versions. So I went to Project Gutenberg and added Australia. I got the Australian Project Gutenberg. I could have gone Project Gutenberg UK or Britain, and it would have brought me up a different database. But it's fun. It's just a fun thing to search, and it's free. Okay. All right, so let's get back to the authors. So the first detective story is generally assumed to be Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue. It was published in the United States of America, and it was published in Graham's magazine in April 1841, and it featured a private detective, Monsieur C. Auguste Dupin. This was, by the way, the first time a writer had used the word detective, not detector or detectorist or policeman. I'll just go back a bit. So the highly intelligent and aloof Auguste Dupin appeared again twice in The Mystery of Marie Roget and The Purloined Letter, a different story. Dupin's dispassionate investigation of witnesses and suspects, his ordered collecting of clues, and his final reveal as to who done it became the model for hundreds of private detectives who followed afterwards. Arthur Conan Doyle cites Poe's detective as one of his inspirations for Sherlock Holmes, and Agatha Christie refers to the influence of Murders in the Rue Morgue. Murders in the Rue Morgue was also the first published locked room mystery in English, as far as we know. Okay. Another American author who appears, all of the people we look at today appear in the Australian newspaper fiction database. Another American author who appears was Anna Catherine Green, and she was born in 1846, lived until 1935, and wrote almost to the end. She actually wanted to be a poet, so she began writing poetry, and for fun she turned to detective fiction. And because she came from a family of lawyers, her detailed knowledge of American criminal law and tight plots made her famous. And in fact, her first novel, published in 1878, was called The Leavenworth Case. It sold more than 150,000 copies, much better than her poetry. So for this and for legal input into later novels, she often consulted her father, who was a practising lawyer. The legal and the procedural detail of this was so accurate that Leavenworth Case was used as a text for law students at Yale College for years. And again, Agatha Christie said she'd taken inspiration to be a writer from Anna Green's work. So Green followed in the footsteps of Edgar Allan Poe, Wilkie Collins, and another very successful American female writer, again of detective fiction, and her name was Meta Victor, but we're not going to cover her today. So here's a list. Sorry, that's the front cover. Yep. Here's a list of Anna K. Green's stories available via Gutenberg Australia, and you can find the work by all of those writers, including Agatha Christie, in To Be Continued, the newspaper fiction database. Some of them are serialised, some are short stories. Now, this article from the Melbourne Age focuses on Australia's first literary sensation, although it's not precisely accurate. Fergus Hume was not an Australian, and he only lived here for a few years in Melbourne. Although he was born in England, he grew up in New Zealand, where he became a lawyer. He moved to Australia and he self-published The Mystery of a Hansom Cab, which was set in Melbourne, where he lived. It's the modern reprint. So the original was picked up by a British publisher, and it rapidly became an international bestseller. In 1888, Hume returned to England, and he had, in his lifetime, over 100 novels published, mostly mystery and detective. And several of those had Australian references or settings, like Madame Midas, like Madame Midas in 1888, Miss Mistopheles, 1890, and The High Water Mark, which came out in 1910. Other Hume stories, such as Next Door, appeared as serialisations in Australian newspapers. Now, in terms of crime fiction, Edgar Allan Poe is deemed, as I said, to have written the first detective story in English with Murders in the Rue Morgue, but it and its two sequels were short stories. The earliest detective novel, though, the novel, may come as a surprise. Any guesses? First English detective novel? Novel, not short story. Sorry?
Mr. Bucket.
In?
That was in Bleak House, actually, but he was based on a real detective.
Yes, dead right, absolutely right. Bleak House and Inspector Bucket was believed to have been based on a real policeman, a London policeman called Charles Field. So it's believed to be Bleak House, first published as a serial by Charles Dickens from 1852 to 1853. Now, this was Dickens' 13th major publication. Dickens had a standard format for his serialised novels. They'd appear in 20 monthly instalments, each containing 32 pages of text, and two illustrations by Hablett Knight Brown, also known as Fizz. And the last two instalments of the novel will be published as a double issue. Coincidentally, there is a strong... I'll just go back. There is a strong connection between Bleak House and another early detective novel, and that's Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone. Now, there are some people who think that The Moonstone was the first detective novel published in English, and it was published in 1868 as a serial in, guess what, Charles Dickens' journal all the year round. So there is a connection between the two. Wilkins' detective was Sergeant Cuff, who was thought also to have been based on a real-life police detective, and he was Inspector Jonathan Witcher, and I think he was one of the very early Scotland Yard detectives. So The Moonstone and other works by Wilkie Collins were serialised in several Australian newspapers, oddly enough including the Catholic Advocate in Brisbane in 1916. All that heathen stuff, I was quite surprised. So, who's the world's most famous fictional detective? Easy one. Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes is one of the most popular characters in fiction ever. Although I'd say his put-upon foil, Dr Watson, is really what makes the Holmes stories memorable. So Holmes was partly inspired by Poe's Auguste Dupin, but he was also based on Dr Joseph Bell, a surgeon and lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, whom Conan Doyle had met back in 1877, and Conan Doyle later said that he'd modelled Holmes' wit and intelligence on him. So this first Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet, came out in 1887, serialised. Doyle continued to write Sherlock Holmes novels and short stories until around 1927, although most of you would probably know somewhat reluctantly. He had Moriarty, the arch-villain, kill Sherlock Holmes off, but he had to bring him back because the public kept complaining. Oh, I don't know. Okay, so The Strand is the important one. The Strand magazine posted most of the early Holmes stories, and it brought Arthur Conan Doyle to public notice. And it's important because the serialisation in the magazines had people sit up and take notice. If they liked what was happening in the magazines, or indeed newspapers, then a publisher would come along and say, this is worth publishing. And then there were novels, then there were royalties, and the writer's reputation kept growing, and he became an author, or she, generally male. Okay, so on the left, Arthur Conan Doyle. On the right, an image of Sherlock Holmes by illustrator and artist Sidney Paget, who was the chief illustrator of the Holmes stories. The role of the illustrator is often overlooked, but before cinema and television, it was absolutely vital. I see some few nodding heads, yes. In building an image of the protagonist, his foes, the setting of the stories and the action. There are a lot of images of people being punched and being attacked by various animals and dogs and, as I said, maidens being tracked by villains and throwing themselves into rivers and all that. Anyway, note the straight pipe on the right in Holmes' mouth. Most of us have an image, I certainly did, of that funny curved, I think it's a meerschaum, but I can't remember. I did the research, but I can't remember offhand. But that curved pipe only came about because there was a stage actor, I don't remember his name offhand, but he was portraying Holmes. And he realised that the smoke from the pipe, in those days they actually did smoke on stage, and the smoke was obscuring his face, and so was the pipe. So they came up with the idea of the curved pipe so that he was above the smoke, and then the smoke sort of lent him this air of mystery rather than blowing straight in his face. But Paget always had him with the long, initially anyway, had him as the long straight pipe. Okay, so there's also an interesting connection between Australia and Arthur Conan Doyle. Well, there are a couple, but I've left one of them out because of time constraints. Here's an 1898 literary review from the Australian newspaper, The Critic. And it says, amongst Australian writers, E.W. Hornung has taken the strongest grip on public taste. For Guy Boothby's works, we'll look at him in a moment, for Guy Boothby's works there's always a certain steady inquiry, but Rolf Boldrewood is slowly dying out. The fact that he is considerably overwriting himself might account for this. Robert Louis Stevenson still lives in the hearts of Australian people through his Treasure Island, Master of Ballantrae, The Wrecker, and etc. Ernest Hornung is the link to Conan Doyle. And there he is on the right. And what links Ernest Hornung to Arthur Conan Doyle is his wife. In the centre, Mrs. Ernest Hornung, and her name was Constance, and Constance was Arthur Conan Doyle's sister, so Hornung was Conan Doyle's brother-in-law. Now, Hornung is most famous for Raffles, the famous gentleman thief, and his companion Bunny, who in some ways resembled Dr. Watson. That would have made for some interesting dinner conversations, I think. But anyway, when young, Ernest Hornung spent several years in Australia to improve his health, and that was fairly common at that time because of the climate. And Hornung then continued to write stories with Australian settings after he returned to England. So here are some of Hornung's stories, which are located in the Australian newspaper fiction database. And I'm going to mention at this point two other early-ish Australian magazines. The first one, the Sydney Bulletin. They had a defining influence, the two I'm going to look at, particularly the Bulletin, on the way Australians saw themselves. So the Sydney Bulletin, 1880 to 2008, saw itself as a radical voice for Australia and Australians, at least until its makeover in the mid-20th century. It was initially overtly racist and proudly touted Australia for the white man, note man, under the banner of nationalism and, of course, the White Australia policy. On the surface, the bulletin was seen to represent the rugged Australian bushman, isolation, wide open spaces, and it was often dubbed the Bushies' Bible. But in reality, it was actually bought by middle-class urban readers. Now, I didn't know that. Its content covered party politics, finance, literature, theatre, sport, and also the cool kids of then Bohemian society. They didn't call them cool kids, but they did call them Bohemians. The bulletin did, however, publish some of the best-known Australian writers of the day. And then came the Lone Hand. There were many other magazines of the time. I've just picked these two as a sample because they are possibly the best known. The Lone Hand came later, began in 1907. There was a connection to the Bulletin, and it produced 213 issues until it closed in 1921. It was actually initially modelled on England's Strand magazine, and it often picked up submissions that were passed over by the Bulletin. It also supported what would probably now be called ultranationalism, although at the time that form of nationalism wasn't regarded as in any way extreme. This, as I said, this is the era of the White Australia policy. Lone Hand printed the work of some of the best-known writers of the time, Roderick Quinn, Dyson, Henry Lawson, tons and tons of them. And while the short story dominated fiction in Lone Hand, it also did serialise a number of novels, including Steele Rudd's The Old Homestead. Many of Australia's best artists also illustrated for Lone Hand, and that included the Lindsays, Norman, Lionel and Percy Lindsay. So the magazine was quite quirky in some ways. It initially used cash incentives and encouraged paid contributions from its readers. It sought fiction, poetry, photography, and it knew how to boost readership. Under the guise of seeking, and I quote, typographical perfection, end quote, cash prizes were offered to those who found the most errors in articles and newspapers. Oh, I'll just go back. There you go. So here's part of the offering close-up. And the magazine also featured columns called To Would-Be Contributors that contained instructions on writing. And the one I like is The Editor's Uneasy Chair. I really like that. But anyway. Why am I not going forward? I'm going backwards. Try that. Okay. Now, the Windsor magazine, back to Britain. These magazines, Strand and Windsor, were of course available in Australia as well, so it might have taken a while to get here though. All right, so the Windsor magazine was named after the British royal castle in an effort to get the support of the monarchy. I believe Queen Victoria did actually read it, but I'm not sure. That could be just a vile rumour. Anyway, it was founded a few years after the Strand magazine, and it was as vital to the career of our next author and many others as Strand was to Arthur Conan Doyle's. And also, please note, this image is not from our collection, although we do hold copies of the Windsor. Please do not place magazines and books face down, as you see here, especially old editions. It's very painful for them. Now, here are some other views of the Windsor magazine. Sequential issues came out in hard copy. And this man was one of the Boothby family, known especially for its plethora of judges and other prominent South Australians. There he is in later life. So Guy Boothby, 1867 to 1905, left for the UK with his mother at age 10, and he returned as a young man. So he worked as a secretary when he came back to Adelaide's Lord Mayor, Lewis Cohen, for several years. And while he was in Adelaide, he wrote a play, which I believe he also acted in. Then he wrote librettos for an opera and 2 light operas with musician, conductor and music teacher Cecil Sharp. Some of you may know the name. Cecil Sharp was a famous UK folk song collector and part of the British folk revival, or basically spearheaded it. Anyway, Guy didn't find the success that he wanted in theatre, which is what he really wanted to write for. So he then went off adventuring with his brother through the Northern Territory and parts of East Asia, and then he returned to England, where he became a novelist. So Boothby was an expatriate writer, and if you're interested in Edwardian expatriates, the writers, this is a very useful work, Lusting for London by Peter Morton. On the right, you'll see part of our extensive collection of Boothby's works, and that it is an extensive collection. This is an early edition of the House Annual with Guy Boothby featuring prominently, in fact right at the top, on the cover's contributor list. And this is Boothby's first novel, published in 1894 with a dedication to his mum. That's quite sweet. Okay, it's an adventure story with illustrations, and this one, as was common, was covered with tissue paper to protect it. That came with the book. But what really brought Guy Boothby fame and fortune, and it was a fortune, a large fortune, was the extraordinarily popular Dr Nikola series. The first novel, published in 1895, was A Bid for Fortune, or Dr Nikola's Vendetta. Farewell Nikola appeared in 1901. Here we go. So his stories were translated into several languages to be published and serialised all over the world, including Australia, of course. And his illustrations were a very strong feature. He worked mostly, but not exclusively, with Stanley Earl Wood, and you can see the wonderful Apollyon. His Nicola's companion was a black cat, Apollyon. That was he was named after a dark angel by Nikola, and it was often seen sitting on his shoulder. Nikola was highly intelligent and cultivated, but would stop at nothing to reach his goal. And the goal was to, I don't think it's a spoiler this many years later, he wanted to acquire a secret Tibetan process of immortality and resurrection. So he was a really evil villain, but quite charming in many ways. Okay, so where are we? There we go. So Boothby's output was enormous. As I said, it was translated into several languages. He became very rich, and he managed the huge output of his works with what was a then very new technology. He spoke his work into the dictaphone, and he had secretaries then type up the manuscripts. There was a famous romance writer who did the same, the one who was the godmother of Princess Diana. Can't remember. Yes, Barbara Cartland. She did the same thing, but not with a dictaphone. But yes, her secretary, she would dictate. Her secretaries would type it up, and Boothby was the forerunner of that. So he made a great deal of money. He didn't seem too worried about the literary quality, and he once told someone, I think it was a reporter, to whom he was showing his mansion. He was showing around. He was into raising dogs, prize dogs, and racehorses and things. And he said, "I give the public what they want, and the public gives me what I want," as he moved on to the next gold-plated set of cutlery. Anyway, Boothby died relatively young in 1905 of pneumonia, but as I said, a very prolific output. Back to Australia, land of sea and sun. Now, by the time you get to the Edwardian period, which is generally considered to end at about World War I, depending on who you talk to, but by the time you get to the early 1900s, the Edwardian period, education has become widespread, labour conditions have improved, and so have wages, and this means leisure time, more leisure time, and not just for the upper and middle classes. So leisure, pre-television and computer screens, meant time to read, and time to read also meant time to read fiction. So magazines and newspapers were increasingly eager to provide the material, and every edition sold meant increasing profit, especially from the advertising. So this is the last writer in today's presentation. His name is Arthur Gask, and he was mostly a post-Edwardian author, with strong links to South Australia. And again, another writer with prodigious output. Gask was from the UK originally and moved to Adelaide, and he worked as a dentist on North Terrace. And he wrote while waiting for his patients to arrive and self-published his first novel here in 1921, and that was Secret of the Sandhills, rapidly followed by Secret Garden. The cover here is a recent reprint by Wakefield Press. So Gask's early books were set in Adelaide, lots of crime, murder, fraud, con artistry, and the requisite class conflict and romance. The first novel was quickly picked up by a publisher, and the rest, as they say, is history. So here are just two of his many books. I think it was 53 in all, and his career continued from the 1920s until his death in 1951. Very adaptable writer. When the war came along, 30s and 40s, he adopted a spy theme. And his ongoing detective hero was Gilbert LaRose. He's a part of the serialised vision from The Advertiser of Friday, January the 18th, 1935. Now that brings us to the end of serial thrillers. But I just want to say that several interesting things came out of researching this story. Firstly, the sheer number of crime and mystery writers, and the fact that a number of these were female, writing certainly in the colonial period in a man's world, especially in Australia. And the second was the breadth of Trove's to be continued newspaper fiction database, and you could, I think, spend several lifetimes exploring it and still not come to the end, and the work is ongoing. As I said, there are well over, I think it's 56,000 and growing for the stories that have been found across genres. And finally, and I think this is probably the most important thing for me, Catherine Bode made a comment in an interview about the to be continued database. Now I'm paraphrasing, but essentially she made the point that in order to become a famous and acclaimed writer, the first step was publication in a newspaper or magazine. Now we're talking colonial period particularly, and then the later Victorian era into the Edwardian period. So for British and American writers, once you were published in a magazine, you'd be widely read, there was a large population base, and this could lead on to being picked up by a publishing house, of which there were many in Britain and America. And that, once you were published as a novelist and sold, you'd get royalties. So your reputation would grow, and it became like an endless positive loop. However, and this was a point Catherine Bode was making, and that she really only picked up when they started researching Australian fiction published in newspapers. In early Australia, there weren't any publishing houses. The printing was done by the newspapers. They had their own presses, but there were no big publishing houses as such. So as a writer, you could only go so far in terms of getting if you were writing a novel, getting it serialised. So you had to get it serialised. You wouldn't have been paid very much if you were unacknowledged, if you weren't anyone important. And so you had to self-publish. But most people didn't have the money to self-publish. So if you remember, I think I mentioned Fergus Hume and Arthur Gask both got their start by self-publishing, and then the sales were so good that they were picked up in each case by a British publisher, I believe. So basically you had a choice. You could publish your novel in serials and hope that it made enough to attract someone's attention, but in Australia you didn't have the choices that were available in Britain and America, and you had to accept the payment, therefore, offered by newspapers and magazines. And as I said, it wasn't a great deal unless you were famous. Catch-22. And that simple fact of the printing opportunities may explain why so many writers went overseas in the late Victorian and Edwardian eras, and why so many writers who were probably just as talented as their overseas counterparts remained unknown here in Australia. So that concludes today's Stories from the Stacks, unless there are any comments or questions. And thank you all for coming. So if there are any questions... Any questions? One? A couple. I saw your hand first. Yeah.
I've just got two things to say about the South Australian Connection. One of them is Gask. My father was a postman, and he usually told me that Arthur Gask, just like Tony Jordan got mail from Shirley Holmes, Arthur Gask got mail for
Gilbert LaRose.
And that was the first thing. The second thing was that Guy Boothby has really hit international fame in the 21st century because a PhD was being written about Dr Nikola, an Italian youth called
De Pascale.
Was fascinated by Dr Nikola when he was a youth. He read all the books over and over again. He was encouraged to study English literature at the University of Padua, and he was such a good student, he was offered a PhD, and he chose to do it on Dr Nikola. And of course, at the time, he looked for an Australian authority on Guy Boothby, and he found one in Adelaide. He made contact, and Paul Pasquale helped him, who was a literary historian at the time, helped him with his PhD. And when the PhD was finally published, a copy made its way to Australia in recognition of the help he got, and that's now international. So, two points about Guy Boothby and Arthur. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, nice information. I've actually seen the thesis. You can get it online. And we also hold the De Pascale material, and he wrote quite a lot on Boothby. He was one of his favourite people, I think. There was somebody up the back? Yes. For what they put in the newspapers or the magazines? Okay, certainly paid for the magazines. It depended on the newspaper in terms of payment. Unfortunately, the material that I was going to look at that was recommended to me by Anthony Lowby, who's our newspaper guru at one of our librarians, head of published collections, when he finally found his notes and said, go to this archival record, and it's got all the advertiser payments and the letters with contracts and the fights with managers and agents of writers and all of that. Unfortunately, the work I wanted was at Netley off-site, and we cannot get into our off-site storage at the moment because something happened to it some months ago now, and the repairs are ongoing, as they say. So I wasn't able to source it, but I have on reliable authority, that is Anthony Lowby, that yes, there were disputes about payment. Probably with the magazines, I think it was more that there were set fees, but it depended on the magazine, it depended on the relationship, it depended on mainly on the standing and whether there was a literary agent. And the bigger ones, of course, like Boothby, had agents or knew their way around the publishing world. In terms of newspapers, it was different. I do remember Anthony saying, I think it was the Kapunda Herald, one of the regional South Australian newspapers, did a lot of printing of work by several local authors in the late colonial period, might have been mid-colonial to late Victorian. And we don't know, or I don't know, whether they were paid an honorarium or whether they were paid an amount, but it would have been low in comparison, certainly for the newspapers, in comparison to the better known authors. And that's as much as I can tell you. There's a thesis in there somewhere. Anyone else? Any other comments? Yes.
I noticed one of the role names, the women often use.
The pseudonyms? The pseudonyms?
Yes.
The aliases, yes.
Was that to do with perhaps they didn't pay as much as the men.
It was to do with the fact, well, in the case of Mary Fortune, she wanted to be a reporter, and she started off on the goldfields, and she was almost hired. They were on the brink, on the strength of her work, although it did contain a lot of Gallicisms, and she was Irish. Irish? Yes, Irish. And anyway, the newspaper on the goldfields, I can't remember which one, was about to hire her, and then they realised, because she put her initials in, that she was a woman, and they took the job away. They just said they withdrew the offer. So thereafter, she always used a pseudonym. Now, it was interesting because the Americans didn't. So the women, some of those two most, Netta and, although she was a pseudonym, and Green, Anna Green, used their own names. But here, you were in a man's world, essentially, and the same for reporting. Unless you were the editor's wife, and many of them were. That was different. But even there, and Mary Thomas is reputed to have written much of what went into the South Australian Gazette and Register and Gazette. But she wasn't acknowledged. But then nobody was acknowledged for their work in newspapers in the early days. So, yeah. Any other questions, comments?
I'm interested to, I wonder why people became so interested in this kind of literature, detective stories, because clearly the newspapers of, say, the last decade at least, sorry, my voice is too soft. If you read the newspapers of at least the last decade of this decade of this 20th century, there are reports of the articles where they describe crimes and accidents also. And there are really graphic descriptions of the injuries, especially or sustained by the victims. So you just had to read the newspaper to have a kind of
sense of what was happening.
yes.
Okay, it's a perennial question, and what Lady was saying was that there was so much true reporting of crime that was incredibly graphic. Why then was there such an interest in crime fiction? Have I got that right? Because you could just read it all in the newspapers anyway, read all about it, literally. Okay, the perennial question is asked about because crime fiction continues to flourish, and it's just this question that goes on and on and on and has always been there. And the answer seems to come back to, in crime fiction, there's an ending. There is some sort of justice. It's kind of like with Gothic horror, where there's revenge and terrible things happen to the people who hidden the body in a cellar or drowned someone in a cask of wine or something. It's a similar thing. It's kind of, this is my theory, it's not necessarily the gospel, we can disagree. But I think crime fiction is about, there's a story, something happens, it's exciting, and if something terrible happens, there is justice. Sometimes it's quite funny, but that's generally not the murders. But it was entertaining. People just seemed to get off on crime. But and with fiction, yes, there was this incredibly graphic period of newspaper reporting. You wouldn't get away with it now. Horrible stuff. And abstracts as well, as I said. But when you get a good writer who can spin out a yarn and make you go, and then what happens? Dickens was the master of this. He would always end on this point where, what happens next? It was kind of like, Pearl Pureheart being tied to the railway line and the train's coming. Somebody going to be able to untie her or she's going to get squished. It's that principle, I think.
Did any of the female writers use a pseudonym like male pseudonym to get their stuff published?
Well, as I said, Mary Fortune used Waif Wanderer and WW. There were others who put in as anonymous. The interesting thing with the newspaper fiction database is that as you get further into it, it may say unattributed for one story, and directly underneath it, it will give the name of the author. As you get further into the unattributed, often you will find the author's name. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I think it's to do with where the foreign troves. I don't know, I'm not clear. But yes, there were many female authors. And in fact, nobody knew, as I think I mentioned, that WW was a female.
That's right.
And I'm sure that there were others. I must also mention, this was particularly for crime fiction, which was Domain's work. For other stuff like children's fiction and all of that, Edith Nesbit, people like that, they were serialised and they used their own names, no problem at all. People writing morality, social commentary, no problems whatsoever. They used their names. That's what they expect.
Yeah, like the politics,
And very often you'll see issues that sometimes you don't switch the names. Thank you, folks.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you.